Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, A New Solution to the Incoming Productions Challenge. I'm Linda Gish, VP of Marketing at RenewData. We have just a few announcements before we begin. Our presenters will leave time at the end for Q&A. You can participate in the Q&A session by asking questions at any time during the presentation. Just type your question into the Ask a Question text area in the bottom of your console, or by clicking on the Q&A widget, then click the Submit button. To receive answers to your questions, please click on the Refresh Now link located at the top of your Q&A box. You may enlarge the slides at any time by dragging the corner of the slide window. Slides will advance automatically throughout the event. If you're experiencing problems with the program, please press the F5 on your keyboard to refresh your console or close and relaunch the presentation. You can also visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the Help widget below the slide window. Now onto the presentation, A New Solution to the Incoming Productions Challenge. Discussing today's topic will be Chris Helleberger and Andy Krafsow. Chris is an attorney at Howard & Howard in Royal Oak, Michigan. He concentrates his practice in patent, trademark, and trade secret litigation, and regularly counsels clients on issues related to records management and retention, electronic communications, and electronic discovery. Chris seeks to utilize technology to facilitate litigation matters and provide additional benefits to clients using such technology for its matters. Andy is Chief Scientist at RenewData. Over the past 25 years, Andy has founded and been CEO of 3 software companies, each of which was ultimately sold to a public company. In 1999, he founded Dolphin Search to bring the power of advanced neural networks mathematics to the legal profession. Trained as a mathematician and a CPA, Andy is one of the pioneers of networked VPN and Internet business applications. His specialty has been in the field of information analysis using various aspects of applied mathematics. I did want to let you all know Chris is in the middle of addressing an emergency, so there is a possibility he may have to leave during the call. He's been kind enough to do this during this emergency, so we just wanted to give you a heads up just in case he has to leave pretty quickly. So now I will turn it over to Chris to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda, and good afternoon to all of our listeners. I will say that you can tell you feel strongly about a solution or approach when you're willing to do a webinar in your hospital gown. So I apologize if I have to leave. I'm in line for some tests, and hopefully it won't be an issue, but if it does, I apologize, and hopefully when we conclude this afternoon, you will see why this solution or approach is such a valuable asset that you can bring to any of your matters. One of the main assets that this solution is that it is a direct, simple approach that allows you to deal with large incoming productions. And that doesn't mean that it's only limited to large incoming productions, but it allows you to assess this productions in a way that you can do 1 million documents and know what those documents say about particular issues by only reviewing a fraction of that set. And Andy will later tell us how many we actually have to review. And the nice thing is any law firm can utilize this technology. And in the end, it will save your client money by not having to employ contract attorneys to review thousands and thousands of documents. And it will also maintain this information that you learn from reviewing the documents within your firm. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this solution will provide a better work product for all of our litigations and for your clients. Linda, if we could go to slide 2, please. So why do we need a new solution to the incoming productions? Well, one of the main reasons why we need this new solution is the availability of data. And on the slide before you represents what types of data is available. We're all very familiar with megabytes and gigabytes, and then we're becoming more familiar with terabytes and petabytes, and as you go up it gets even larger. To give you some idea of what these numbers represent, the average office worker in 1 year writes 2.5 volumes of War and Peace. So we all know War and Peace is a very large book. In a year, we write 2.5 times that in emails. And Andy likes to say that the reason we do this is because we've become ridiculously polite. And I'm sure you see it in your offices, the emails where it says there's food in the lobby and someone writes back, thank you very much, and you're welcome, and no thank you. And it's a back and forth that you really don't have in normal conversations. And when you generate emails, thankfully I suppose, it gets replied to all. And then you have a long chain of emails. And so this 2.5 novels of War and Peace gets generated very quickly and on massive amounts of data that aren't relevant to your cases. And to give you an idea of what these volumes represent, or these sizes, the Library of Congress is the largest library in the world. And it has 838 miles of bookshelves. And that represents 158 million items. And that volume would be equivalent to 30 petabytes. And petabytes is a number that we aren't seeing yet in litigation, but I know that we are certainly exceeding gigabytes and into terabytes. And the first gigabyte hard drive to recognize the difficulties that we're facing was invented in the 1980s. And it cost $40,000, and it was 550 pounds. That's how big it was. And today, you can go out to Amazon and you can buy a 256 gigabyte thumb drive for merely $200. And so it's with this availability that all of our corporations and clients, large and small, are generating data that now we have to wade through and handle as part of our litigations. Can we go to the next slide, please, Linda? And so these incoming productions now present special challenges. In the 90s and 80s, we had plaintiff bars that would produce very little by way of documents. And on the defendant side, they were the ones that would have large productions. So it wasn't an even problem. It was only a one-sided problem. Now, since these data sources are available, there are applications that every one of us utilizes and that every one of our custodian utilizes, whether it's their desktop or laptop computers, you have their mobile devices, and then all of the other portable devices, whether they're thumb drives, CDs, you name it, they all exist. Even our cameras can carry data now. And then expanding that beyond just the devices and the applications, you get to the social networking, the emails, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the LinkedIn. Each one of these sites is a potential data source that we have to deal with for these litigations. And they're nearly unlimited in data volumes. And if you think about a typical case where you have a couple years of relevant data, over a 3-year time period, a single custodian is going to have 7 War and Peace novels of data in their email. And this is a fundamental shift because both sides now have to deal with this tremendous volume. Slide 4, Linda. So this solution, what are the overall objectives that this solution provides? Well, first and foremost, when we are dealing with incoming productions, it's a little bit different than when we are doing our own productions. First, we want to decide if we've spent a lot of time crafting these document requests. We want to know if the other side has in fact met their obligations and produced those documents to me. Hopefully when you are doing your document productions, you are going through and producing the relevant documents. Now it's our turn to review the incoming productions and make sure that they in fact have done that. Secondly, you want to learn what the documents say about the issue. And what that means is, if we use an example where John went to the store, when you're producing your documents, you are looking for documents that say John went to the store or anything that mentions John went to the store. Well, when you're doing an incoming production, now you need to know specific facts or more details about John going to the store that helps your case or that helps you win your case. And so you want to learn what these documents say about the issue. And then lastly, one of the objectives is to identify the exhibits the highly relevant documents that you're going to use. We all know that when you get to the trial stage or even the summary judgment stage of your cases, you're going to be using a fraction of the total population. And when you are producing hundreds of thousands of records, you are not going to be presenting more than 100, maybe even a couple hundred if you're lucky, at the summary judgment stage, and even smaller than that at trial. So you want to quickly find those hot documents. And to give you a real example from one of my cases where I got to utilize this solution, we had an incoming production that dealt with about 100,000 records. And the other side was quite kind. They gave us these documents when there was about 4 to 6 weeks left in discovery, and we had to conduct fact depositions of about 15 people on each side. So there were 30 depositions to prepare and take in 4 to 6 weeks, and we had these 100,000 documents dumped on us at the last minute. And I want to say it was something like 500,000 pages of documents. So using our approach, we were able to filter through, and we'll get into the details of how we do this, but we were able to, out of that 100,000, quickly identify about 7,000 documents that were right on point. They said what we needed them to say about our issues. And then from those 7,000 to kind of follow it through, when we went through the summary judgment and the expert phases of our case, 75% of those marked exhibits were identified in that first 7,000. And you might say, well, what about the other 25%? Well, those tended to be things like pictures, which wouldn't be retrieved in this sort of tool, or handwritten documents, which also would need eyes-on actual review instead of the technology tools. And it was certainly for the client a very quick and expeditious way of handling it, and I think it was very meaningful, the results, as evidenced by how many were used in expert reports and the summary judgment motions. And overall, the savings for being able to use the tool versus contract attorneys, I think we saved something over $50,000 to $75,000 in savings if we would have tried to do the linear review. So it was very helpful and overall a good tool. And on the slide, we also mentioned predictive coding, and I'll hand it over to you, Andy, if you want to discuss that.
I will. Thanks, Chris. I think before I do, though, I'd just like to say again what you just said in a way to get everybody focused. So we've got a big incoming production, and there are basically 3 things that we have to accomplish. We first have to decide whether the other side met their obligations. Did they send us documents about the stuff that we asked for? Did we get them? And when you're getting a ton of documents, that's not always such an easy question to answer. The second thing is we've got to figure out what the documents actually say about the issues of the case. We know in principle, hopefully, that most of the documents we received are about the topics, but we don't know what they say about the topics. We have a lot of theories and thoughts, of course, but now we've got the real stuff in front of us, and we've got to take a look. And then finally, out of that big mass of stuff coming in, we have to find a couple hundred case exhibits. And when you look at these criteria, you kind of say to yourself, well, isn't this what predictive coding is all about? We all know that predictive coding, or sort of machine intelligence-assisted review, is the very hot topic today. And it's a viable topic when you're talking about your own productions, because there, you know, the obligation is to deliver to the other side all the documents that are about the issues. So when you think about how do I figure out if a document is about a topic, well, in a more linguistic technical sense, you're looking for noun phrases. And that's exactly what a predictive coding engine is built to do. So coding engines are pretty good at figuring out what subject a document might be about. But they don't help at all when you're trying to figure out what the document says about that subject. And next slide, Linda, please. So we're kind of on our own. We don't really have machine intelligence available to help us figure out what the documents say about the issues. And as you can see on this slide, basically we're highlighting that. And outgoing criteria is, have I found a document about the issue? Incoming, what does the document say? Okay, Lyndon,
Sandy, may I real quick on this slide 5 real quick? May I jump in?
Yeah.
One of the things when we think about the outgoing obligations, I like to think of your point of view as the law firm or attorneys who are reviewing these documents. And when you are collecting everything and trying to make that relevance and is it about the issue, I think we all take a very high-level review and we try to produce documents that are, well, someone could argue, and we try to satisfy our obligations under the rules that we have to do. And we are certainly looking for what the documents say about the issue because we are always building our internal stories. However, we really don't care at that point. We want to satisfy our obligations and get the documents produced out, satisfying the timelines. Once we get our incoming productions, it changes. Our perspective is now different. Now we don't necessarily want every document. We want to find out what are they saying about this issue, or what do the documents help our case? How does it help our case? And so that's really, I think, the perspective and point of view of how it shifts. We almost wear a different hat on the outgoing productions as we do on the incoming productions. Okay, next slide.
That's right. And because we wear that hat, we have to work up a workflow that is slightly different. And in the next slide, you'll see the workflow that we have created. It's basically 5 steps. And what we have found that if you can follow these 5 steps along, and they don't take very long, we're talking days, not weeks or months, believe it or not, we are going to be able to figure out what a document collection, say of 1 million incoming documents, before we've read 10 or 15,000 at the very most, we'll know what the documents say about the issues. We'll know whether or not the other side has met their obligation and produced the documents they should. And we'll be able to select intelligently our court exhibits all very quickly. So as I hope you'll see, this is a very clever, very simple method, but it's battle tested, and Chris, I'm sure, has lots of war stories that we can add as we go along about how this works. So the first step is to create an organization scheme. Think about it. You're getting in hundreds of thousands of documents. You can't leave them in a big pile. You've got to come up with categories and subcategories and buckets and that sort of thing. There's got to be some way to organize these. So let's talk about that. And I'm sorry, Chris?
I'm sorry, we're on slide 7, Andy?
I'm on slide 6 still.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's no problem. So what you see are these 5 steps. We're going to create an organizational schema. We're going to determine a strategy for each category, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. We're going to figure out a way to populate the documents into those categories. We're going to analyze what we see to see if the other side met their obligations, and then we're going to come up with a very clever way to look at enough documents so that we know what the collection that we've received says about all the issues and identify our case exhibits. So what we're going to do next is look at each one of these steps in a little bit of detail, enough I hope that you can leave here and say to yourself, I could do this, because that is our objective. So Linda, next slide, please, number 7. So the first step is to create an organizational schema. And that's a fancy way of saying create categories and subcategories that you'll put the incoming collection into so you've got it organized in some way. What we found over the years is that when you ask an attorney or anybody else to think of what categories and subcategory names should be, how should I organize this? It's pretty tough to do because you're trying to think in such a broad spectrum. So we found a clever way of coming up with all those categories without going at it in such an abstract fashion. And that is to write what we call about statements. And an about statement is really very simple. It's just saying, I want all documents about X. And what you want to do is you want to write an about statement for everything you can think of. I want documents about fraud. I want documents about going to the store. I want documents about stealing my patents. I want documents about discrimination. Whatever it is the case is about, just write every about statement you can think of. Now what happens when you do that is 2 things. First, it's really easy for you to think of the things that you want to read documents about, and it's very easy for you to notice if those statements that you've written are ambiguous. So by just changing your mental picture from trying to come up with the names of the categories and subcategories in an outline or in a taxonomy, all you're trying to do is write the about statements, because when you write them all, there's your categories and your subcategories. So I know that...
May I jump in real quick?
Please.
The about statements, from the lawyer's perspective, we are already in the mindset of doing that, because when we start in these cases, early on we all draft our document requests and we send them out, and those document requests are supposed to be documents about your case, and you've already started to identify those areas that you need to find evidence to win your case. And so I know that some document requests are general, broad, high level, and then we do get a little more specific on the details of your case. And so when you get around to drafting about statements, it's a very fluid process. And I can tell you, working with Renew on these sort of projects, when you sit down and you talk with them and you say, they say, what is your case about? And you say, well, it's about this. And then it drills down and you really get some very solid about statements, which can become the roadmap for not only your document review, but really for the rest of your case.
Yes, it's really very easy, and what we find is that within 2 hours you can make a list of about statements that everybody on your case team looks at it and says, yep, based on what we know now, this is what we think we're looking for. Because part of what you're going to do is you're going to say, did I get documents about each of these things that I was expecting? And so by having these statements well defined, it makes it easy to answer that question. Often people say, well, how granular should I get? What we find is that if you have a big document collection, for reasons that you'll see in a minute, 40 or 50 categories is nowhere near too many. It feels about right, and that's usually when we're done. In a typical case, what we've got is we're looking for documents about, and there's 40 to 50 of those sentences. Okay, so, and I guess one last point, Chris, we know that we don't know everything when we start, that when we actually start looking at these documents that have come in, we might get some more abouts that we weren't expecting. That's okay. You've got to start somewhere. And if you can write 30, 40, 50 statements about what you know at the inception, you're well on your way to having a good organizational schema.
And that, Andy, that is one of the not only do you not have all the information at the beginning, but the nice thing I find with your tool is that you don't lose information as you go forward either. And so you can continue to refine your searches and you learn from the document. And whether it's bringing other people on the case or talking to consultants or whatever you need to do in your case, you have all of this information recorded almost as you progressed in your learning knowledge on the case. So you can almost look back at it and see, this is what we originally thought, this is how it changed from your development of these about statements.
And Chris, one other thing, and I'm thinking of a case that we worked on with you on this. If the other side has failed to produce documents about one of your statements, in other words, about a topic that you expected to get things, if you can say, wait, you didn't produce documents about this, it's a very easy way of communicating what's lacking to the other side rather than starting to argue about search terms and proximities. So we've always found that it's a helpful way to communicate with the other side if you're feeling like they haven't done what they're supposed to. It's pretty clear, hey, we expected documents about this issue and there aren't any. Okay, so now you've got your series of about statements, and we can call those categories and subcategories. They're synonyms for each other. Now what you've got to do is you've got to create a strategy for each of those categories. The reason for that is you have limited time and limited budget. You can't look at every document that's going to come in most of the time. There's just no budget for it. There's no time to do it in a large case. Our experience is that clients are often less willing to spend money looking at the other side's documents than they are at their own documents, making it worse. So essentially you want to ask yourself one of three questions, or answer one of three questions around each of the categories that you've created. How many documents do I need to find from this category? Do I need to find every single example that I can? So maybe if you're trying to show one of the categories is documents that show that that the number of errors in manufacturing was just an avalanche of problems, Maybe in such a circumstance you want to try to find every single document that you can that talks about one of those problems. But when you think about the number of case exhibits that you're really going to submit to the court and things like that, most of the time that isn't really your strategy. Sometimes. But mostly your strategy is to find enough documents that you know that you can prove the points that you want to make, and you can stop and move on to the next category, because our goal is to try to limit the amount of review, limit the number of documents we have to be reading before we're finished. So we had 3 potential strategies. I need as many documents, as many examples as I can possibly find from this category. I need enough to prove my point, and I'll know when I have enough when I get there. And in this category, I'm really hoping to find a smoking gun. I'm thinking there's only 1 or 2 documents that are going to prove my point, and that's what I'm looking for. And we write these strategies down, associate a strategy with each category, because it imposes the self-discipline that's really necessary as time gets short near the end of the review, so that you remember what you came to do.
And Andy,
and Chris, I guess.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know if this is where one of the comments we wanted to touch on, and I'm not sure if this is where we wanted it, but it's one of these things that when you, and we haven't talked yet about the number you're going to review from each of these cases, but when you have looked at them and you aren't finding it, when you aren't finding the responsive document or the documents that you think exist or should exist, what do you then do? To you, Andy.
Oh, you're asking me what do you do? Well,
yeah. Well, what's your approach? I mean, when you think there's a category that you are not seeing documents for, in other words, like.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back. Well, first I'm going to prove, so that I'm not wasting anybody's time, that the documents that I expected really aren't there. And then I'm going to go back to the other side and I'm going to complain about it. I'm going to say, wait a minute, I know you have documents about this topic. This was in my discovery request. I didn't get them. The way that I'm going to be able to know that, go ahead, Chris, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Andy. Maybe you're going there. Where I thought you were going to go or suggest was the looking from the, when you're looking for that smoking gun and you have the word list.
If I'm looking for the smoking gun. So essentially, let me talk about how we get the documents into their categories first, and then we'll talk about how we look for them, because I think it's a more logical sequence. What we've got to do, and Linda, can I get the next slide, please? So now we've got our categories. Our about statements helped us create those. And we've assigned a strategy to each of those categories. Are we looking for everything, enough until I'm satisfied that I've got what I need, or that elusive smoking gun that Chris is talking about? How do I get the documents into those categories? And the answer is you're going to write search strings. So the thing about an about statement, let me show you how you do this. This is a very mechanical process. It really isn't very hard at all to do. And it's the kind of thing that you can test to 95 or 98% certainty when you're finished to make sure that you have done a good job of it. The way you're going to do this is, let's use an example. Let's suppose that one of our abouts is a price fixing case, let's say, and one of our about statements is that I need all the documents that are about meetings with competitors where price was discussed. Meetings with competitors where price was discussed. Pretty common kind of thing. For a document to be about that topic, it has to have a word in it or some words that tell you when meeting took place. It has to tell you, have some words or words that tell you that competitors were present, and the same thing with price. So if we were going to write a search string that would find documents that are about that, meetings with competitors where price was discussed, we would write, in principle, a query that says meetings and Sony or Mitsubishi or whoever the competitors were with ors between them, and price. And that would give us, the results of those documents would fit into that category. Now we know that there's a lot of ways to talk about the word meeting, so writing just the word meeting wouldn't be enough. We'd have to figure out what other words might be used by the other side to talk about meetings that took place, because I could have coffee or dinner with Chris and we would all know that infers a meeting. There's a very simple way to find those synonyms, and that is to print out the words that are actually in the document collection and order them by part of speech. We at Renew built a little tool that does that. Most of the platforms have a way of printing out the vocabulary because the vocabulary is extracted when they index it and make the document searchable. What you find is looking through those word lists is pretty quick because all of us only have about a 25,000 word vocabulary that are on the phone together today. Post-college graduate English speakers have about a 25,000 word root vocabulary. About half of those words are nouns, about half of what remains are verbs. So to look through the nouns and verbs, to find all the words that you think could possibly talk about a meeting really only takes 5 or 6 minutes. It's very fast because the way language is stored in your brain, as quickly as you can cognate what the word is, you know what it means. So if I showed you a list of words and said, okay, tell me which of these you think possibly could connote the idea of a meeting, as fast as your eyes can go down the list, you know the answers. The slowest part is moving your eyes and making it a check mark or something. And that's how we go about creating the search strings that populate the categories. If we miss something, we'll find it, as I'll show you in a moment. But most of the time, you're very good at it because if you have good attorneys working on the case, like Chris, who know the language of the domain of their client's business, this is very easy to do. Remember in high school how much easier it was to do a multiple choice question than a fill-in-the-blanks question. If I show you the nouns that are in this collection and say, here's your choices, tell me which ones could possibly connote the notion that a meeting took place, boy, it's really easy for you to do this. So I can tell you that in a day you can build all of these search strings that will populate the incoming collection into the categories you've created. And once that's done, now you can take a look and say which categories didn't get any documents or which categories got too few documents. Also, not every document is going to populate. There are going to be some that don't get hit by any of the search strings. And with those, we want to sample those and ask ourselves, did we miss something? Is there something here that we haven't seen that we didn't think of? Or is this all junk?
And I think we're on slide 9, correct?
Well, I'm wandering, I guess, but yeah.
Okay, well, while we're on slide 9, before you go further, I want to make a comment that when you have this actual vocabulary from your database, that is an amazingly powerful tool because I know that I've had conversations with opposing counsel where they say, well, we don't know how they would have said it. And I can say, well, here's the word list. Go through it. If you want to add another word to my search or if you want me to include it, just tell me which words you want. Here they are. And it's very persuasive, I think, when you're in front of a judge trying to convince the judge that the search that you did is satisfactory and your basis for doing the search. When you can show them that list, it's a very good tool. And when Andy talks about going through the list and you're looking at the words and trying to pick out which ones you want, I find that the slowest part is when you reach a word and you're like, well, does that stand for meeting or could it? Maybe you're looking at a word like golf. Maybe they did golf and that's where they met. And with this tool, you can just include it. Or if you just say, throw it in and we'll see what you get. It's a defined world that you live in because you have the actual vocabulary and no longer are you in a thesaurus of words trying to figure out, well, what might they have said? And that's a time-saving benefit that I don't think is matched by anything else.
Yeah, it's really helpful to have the vocabulary because it takes all the fight with the other side away. Here are the actual words that are there. If you want me to consider that I had played golf with Sony and talked about price yesterday, sure, I'll throw it in there and look. Once you've got your search strings, which again, I know it sounds like a lot of time, but really you can do this in a day. So we've had a day to create our about statements and decide what our strategy is for each one, every document, some documents, another day or two to do this. And now on slide 10, Linda, now you've got all these documents in the categories. And you can ask yourselves the questions that you need to ask. Did I get documents in every category? Maybe I thought I would get a lot of documents in an important category and I only got 50. So I'm going to go back and make some noise about that. I'm going to look and sample the documents that we didn't populate. Did we miss a category? Was the other side thinking about something that was relevant that we had totally overlooked? Did we miss an important synonym for the word meeting that we didn't think about until we saw it in our sample?
And Andy, one of your stories that I've heard is when you think there should be a document because there's a rumor. And this is, I think, earlier where I was suggesting. When everyone says something took place and you want to find out why you didn't find that document, how would you handle that situation?
Okay, so what we're really talking about here is how do you find a smoking gun? How do I review these documents in the category? And so let me talk to you about that because this is one of the most interesting parts of this process. And Linda, maybe we'll go to slide 11 just to talk about it. So you've got documents in a category, and let's just make an example. Let's say we got 100,000 documents coming in, and we had 10 categories to make my numbers real easy, so we have 10,000 documents in each category. How do we review those? How do we find out what those documents say? And if there's a smoking gun, if one of our objectives is to find a smoking gun, how do we do it? So here comes a little bit of mathematical magic. This mathematics is why Las Vegas is profitable. It's an offshoot of the Poisson distribution. Poisson was a 19th century French mathematician, and he was hired by the Austrian emperor to figure out how frequently the cavalry horses kicked their riders. And in coming up with this mathematical formula, this thing called the Poisson distribution, he changed mathematics. Because today we use that math for just about every kind of event-centric measurement you can think of. What's the probability I'm going to get hit by a truck when I walk through that intersection? Which line is the fastest at the airline counter? All those kinds of questions are Poisson distribution questions. But even more, Einstein used the Poisson distribution to figure out how many atoms there are in the universe. So this is very, very fundamental mathematics. It's also the mathematics of Las Vegas. How probable is it that some event will take place? And when you think about what you're trying to do when you review documents, it's really a probability question. How many documents do I have to look at before I know the story that they're telling about this particular category? I've got 10,000 documents in my meetings with competitors where price was discussed bucket. How many do I have to read before I understand what they all say? The answer is way fewer than you think. You have to read 300 documents to be 95% certain that you've seen language that appears in that collection or in that category in more than 1% of the documents. So I'm going to say that a couple different times, a couple different ways because it's a little bit confusing. But the essence is you only have to read 300 documents selected at random from the category to be 95% certain you know exactly what those documents say about the topic. Even if there's 100,000 or 500,000 documents in the topic categories, you only have to read 300 to be 95% certain that you've seen all the language that would be relevant. Now that's an amazing result. It's very widely used in studies of disease and things. How often, how much do I have to look at to see an event that's relatively rare? And the answer is way less than you think. So think about this. If I had created 40 categories, I wrote 40 about statements, what I'm saying is you're 95% certain to understand what all of those documents say about the topics by reading 300 documents in each one. So 300 times 40, 12,000 documents, even if there's millions. I know that most attorneys aren't math majors. Most attorneys hate math when I even start to talk about it. But here math is your friend because the amount of effort that you have to put in to actually know with measurable certainty what these documents say is so few. Now, if I'm looking for a smoking gun, I have a sort of a different problem. Linda, how about slide 12, please? Because a smoking gun occurs, by definition, only 1 or 2 times. So back to my example of the bucket that contains all the documents about price fixing, meetings with competitors where price was discussed. If I have 10,000 documents in there, what I've just said is if I read 300 at random, I'm sure to see, 95% sure to see all the language that's in those documents that I would care about, that it appears in more than 1% of that 10,000, so of 100 documents. But if I'm looking for a smoking gun, I might be looking for something that only exists in language that only exists in 1 or 2 documents, and so I have to take a different approach. So when I need to find every document that I can, when I need to find as many documents as I can, the 300 is a great number because it's such a high level of certainty. But when I'm looking for the smoking gun, I've got to do something different. And here's where your word lists really come in handy. So at Renew Data, what we do is when we extract that vocabulary from the collection, we extract all the words that are in the documents. We order the words by frequency of occurrence. In other words, we're saying, show me how many documents this word appears in. And, we order them from the words that appear in the most documents down to the ones that appear in only 1 or 2. If I'm looking for a smoking gun, I'm going to start, instead of at the top of the list and looking at vocabulary words to think about my search strings, I'm going to start at the bottom of the list. I'm going to start looking at the words that appear in only 1 or 2 documents because I know what they are. I can see them on my list, and my question is, do they convey the concepts I'm looking for? Because if it's a smoking gun, by definition, I'm not looking for words that appear in tens of thousands of documents. I'm looking for words that only appear in 1 or 2. So, Chris, that's how I do it. Is we start at the bottom of the list when it's a smoking gun. Now, most cases aren't looking for smoking guns, but sometimes you are. And here you've got the actual words in the collection and how many documents they appear in to use as your guide to try to figure out which documents could have the potential to be that smoking gun.
And Andy, other than looking for the smoking gun, if I am looking at my first 300 in my category and I finish that 300 and I haven't found what I expected to find, what's the next step?
Well, you have 2 things that you might want to take a look at. So here's what we do. When you find a document and you're going, yeah, this is relevant, you're reading the 300 and you're saying, this says something important to me, we like to highlight that language that you see and tag all the other, write a little Boolean search and tag all the other documents in the category that say that same language, so that by the time I'm done reading my 300, I've tagged every document that has any good language I saw in the 300. Now the number of documents left in that pile of 10,000 is way smaller. One of the things you learn is that there are very few ways, really, a dozen, maybe 2 at the very, very most, ways that any topic is spoken about in a collection in a way that's relevant to you. We're social creatures, we humans. There are a lot of different ways you could talk about something, but we share language. If I write to you, Chris, and say, hey, the software blew up on me, you write me back, yeah, it blew up on me too. We share language. And so by doing that highlighting game, by saying, okay, every time I see something in the 300 I care about, I'm going to highlight and then tag all the other documents that say whatever I highlighted, I'm going to have very few documents left. So I can go look at them all. I can sample in that collection if I want. If it's a little bit too big, maybe I'll read 150. But I want to satisfy myself that I haven't made a mistake before I go argue with the other side that they failed to produce something that we know exists. So that's how we would go about it, kind of process of elimination.
And I think one of the things, Andy, that allows us to, with certainty, say these sort of things is we're pulling them at random. Can you expand on that a little bit?
So randomness is the magic. One of the things that Poisson, that mathematician I mentioned, figured out is if you're looking for needles in a haystack, and that's pretty much what you're doing in document review, the most efficacious way to do that is to stick your hands into the straw and pull out by random. Random tells you so much when you look at things at random. The space between good results when you're pulling things at random tells you how close you are to the end. It tells you how probable you are that you've found what you're looking for or will find what you're looking for. So whenever you're doing any kind of examination of a collection of documents, there's a lot of power in saying, show me the next document at random, please. Because those spaces and distances tell you a lot about the thing that you're pulling from, the collection that you're pulling from. So I know it often seems like the best way to do a review would be by date, by custodian, and sometimes that's true. But in general, all of the power is in random.
When I can say that from the attorney perspective, managing these reviews and working with a client, we certainly have personalities where we want to look at every document, and unfortunately the budgets aren't there to do that with these large collections. And since we can't look at everyone, getting that sense of confidence that when you're going through these reviews and all of a sudden the space between relevant documents gets bigger and bigger, and then you look at a string of 100 documents and you don't see a relevant document, there's that level of confidence that says we've done it, we've found the relevant ones, and there's other testing methodologies, Andy, I know that we've used the zero defect test to give us that level of confidence. Can you tell us what that briefly is?
Well, sure. So if you looked at 250 documents in a row, each one was selected at random, and you didn't see anything that was relevant to you, you know with 95% confidence that there's nothing in that pile from which you're pulling those samples that's relevant to you. So by looking at just 250 in a row, every one being non-relevant, that tells you with 95% certainty that you're finished.
And that's a defensible position to the court,
Absolutely.
Right?
Oh, yeah. This kind of lot acceptance testing has been in front of judges for a very long time because it's used in every manufacturing industry. Every regulatory body except the SEC or the DOJ uses it, but the Department of Defense mandated this sort of testing in the 80s. It's ubiquitous. I guess the good news about this is that in statistics, the sample size doesn't change based on the size of the population. And so you can do a tremendous amount of work looking at a surprisingly small number of things to a very high level of certainty. If you were to ask a team of contract attorneys to read 100,000 documents, what's the human error rate? Well, if you ask Judge Peck, he'd probably tell you in excess of 20%. But if you sample, you can get your sampling error rate down to 1 or 2%. So it's so surprising, it's so unintuitive to many people, but the best way is actually not to put an army on a very large collection and have them go through it. Their mistakes are going to be 20 times the number of mistakes that if you took this sampling 300 at a time by category approach. So it's much more accurate, and as I said, there's lots of years, decades of precedent about the accuracy of this stuff around things where if the manufacturing is bad, it's going to kill you, not just bad documents. So pills and drugs and bullets and all those kinds of things, they're all tested this way. Chris, I think we have pretty much come to the end of our time. We only have a few minutes left, and I know that Linda was going to collect the questions. And so, Linda, are you there? Do we have any questions?
I am. We do have a few. The first question, how long does it take to set all of this up and get started?
Soup to nuts, you're done within 1 business week.
Okay.
Aside from the review of the 15,000 documents or 10,000, but everything else easily within 1 business week.
And so if I can just expand a little bit on that from the attorney side, one of the things that you do when you're going to use this approach is obviously you have to get the data to the likes of Renew, and so they can ingest it and process it. And that does take a little bit of time, but very insignificant. And then once it's processed, you would have the conversation with Andy and his team about the bail statements. What is the case about? And then this list of terms gets developed. And once that happens, it literally is almost like at least from my perspective, it feels like you hang up the phone and they're getting you the results right away. So I definitely think a week is fair, and it's probably even less than that.
Great, thanks. So this is a question back to the earliest, the first slide. Are yottabytes, zettabytes, etc. real industry accepted terms?
I believe that they are.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I've worked a lot of my career with government agencies that collect a lot of data, and we certainly talk about exabytes. I've never actually worked with the top 2, so I don't know if anybody really uses them or not. I mean, they're real words in a real dictionary, but I've never been involved in anything that large.
Well, yeah, and I can add, Andy, that right now I think the amount of data that exists according to some of the studies, and I think this was an MIT review, that they've said that we are only at 2.8 zettabytes. So we haven't yet transcended to the other number, but
on our way.
Yeah.
And Chris, I believe this question goes back.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Andy.
Oh, I was just going to say, if you talk to people at the NSA, exabytes is a real thing.
Right. So Chris, I believe this goes back to a case you were discussing earlier, and the question was, were the 500,000 documents you mentioned receiving shortly before trial in paper or digital format?
So in that case, it was agreed that we would produce TIFF images, and I don't think we did OCR of the TIFF images, so I think it was just straight up single-page TIFF images, which we then had to process to get into the searchable format. Ideally, when you're doing these sort of ESI collections, in that particular case, the opposing counsel was not the most compromising, and so we didn't actually exchange. It would be nice if you could exchange native format of the documents instead of getting the TIFF images. And then even if you don't get the native, it would be nice if you can get the full text from, if you have a Microsoft Word document and someone is converting it to a TIFF, along with that is going to come the full text. That's the next optimal opportunity. And then even if they don't do that, then you can OCR it, which is what we had to do.
Right. And the next question, wouldn't the organizational schema correspond to the request for production?
Yeah, it should. It should. But what we find often is that the request for production as it was written wasn't so well constructed, and so there's a lot of overlaps, and there's redundancies and things like that. So we're trying to clean that up so that we have a series of unambiguous about statements, unambiguous categories, where a document may be coded into, may fit into a couple categories, but the same words, the same exact words, would mean two different categories. So it's our starting point always, but generally those things were put together without the thought of being unambiguous, and so we have to clean them up, and the best way we usually find to do that is to talk about it in terms of abouts, because it's real easy to see when two things are kind of the same when you use a simple word like about. When you use the fancy legal terms that are on the document request, often it's a little more obfuscated whether those are actually the same thing or not.
And Andy, I think I can comment that when you get to that ending point of the trial, when you're not using a tool like this or end of a case, and you have assessed all the documents and you're looking back and your team is having that discussion that says, well, where is this document? And then someone inevitably will say, well, we asked for this document, right? And you go back and you look at the document request and you read through them and you're like, well, it kind of fits in this one. Maybe it fits in this one. And so I think that's a good example of the clarification that you can get when you do the about statements.
It's such a simple way of thinking that it makes a difficult task very direct to accomplish. It's a trick, but it's a good trick.
And the next question, does RenewData offer software that can be processed in-house, or does RenewData staff perform all the analytics on a full-service basis?
We generally perform on a full-service basis. Doesn't mean we have to.
And Andy, real quick on that point, one of the things that I find most helpful is you bring with your team the linguists or librarians, the word experts, and they know so much more about how these sentences can be structured that is a service that, while you've suggested that you can get there, you are the experts, and that's a service that I find invaluable from you guys.
I'm glad you say that, but I kind of disagree with you. I think that's just me fooling you, because the one who really knows all the words of the case, you're working on some IP case about automotive parts or whatever, it really isn't us. It's having counsel who knows the domain of the client's business, the words of the domain of the client's business. They know how people talk in that business. what we find is this is a method that's really powerful in the hands of attorneys who really know the space that they're litigating in. Because, I mean, I've been around a long time. I've done a lot of cases. I've been exposed to a lot of words and a lot of different industries and domains. But I'm not nearly as good as you are, Chris, in the fields that you work in, because you do it every day. And you've talked to the client and you've talked to the employees of the client. You're way ahead of me. I just make it seem like it's me so that you pay me.
Well, we'll have to agree to disagree, because I think my English teachers and professors might disagree with you. But
okay, and the next question.
Time?
We have a couple more minutes yet. So I have a couple more questions. What review platforms does this integrate into, or is it separate from something like Relativity?
So it integrates into Relativity, but we also, the word extraction, we wrote a little gadget that'll do that, so that's pretty much platform independent. Extracting the words out of the vocabulary and organizing them we just wrote a little widget that does that. But basically, Relativity is the platform that we try to make everything work in because it's so commonly used.
And if I can, the first time I used this approach, it was not with Relativity, and I had in-house summation is where we were keeping our data, and Andy's team did the work, and we did the word list and the about statements and all that, and the output I was able to import into our summation and utilize to extract those 7,000 documents. I have also done it with the Relativity, and it's not mandatory, but it's certainly
cleaner.
If you have the Relativity, it is there's more you can do with it. It's more powerful.
Yeah, but we do, as Chris said, we work with people that have summation or concordance. I mean, conceptually, this is more of a workflow than a technology. If you think about it, there isn't any technology involved in any of this except a Boolean search engine. So it's really leveraging the knowledge the attorney has about the language and the issues. It's not a very high-tech sort of solution.
Okay. How many issues do you typically see or recommend when going through this process?
Well, as I said, we usually end up with about somewhere between 40 and 60 about statements in a typical case. So I don't know. I guess a typical case probably at the issue level has 15 or 20 kind of major issues and some sub-issues, and that translates into slightly more about statements because we try to be pretty granular. If you remember, we want to be 95% certain we've seen everything that appears in more than 1% of the documents. So we want that 1% to be the smallest number possible, and we accomplish that in part by having a pretty good number of categories. So, 40 to 60 about statements is pretty typical. I think we've had some with as many as 80 and maybe some with as few as 30 or 35.
Okay, great. And we are at the top of the hour. So I wanted to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. If you would like to find out about the next steps and talk with Andy or Chris further, please reach out to them. Chris's number is 248-723-0453. And you can reach Andy or anyone else at Renew Data at 888-811-3789. And if you have additional questions that you would like to submit, please feel free to email Kathy Rogers, and that is KAPHY.ROGERS@renewdata.com. And we will be happy to get back to you. An archive will be made available for today's presentation, and an email will be sent out to everyone once it is available for access. So on behalf of our speakers, I would like to thank you for your time and also thank our speakers, and especially Chris for doing this and from a hospital bed. We really appreciate it, and I think that it's really some valuable information. So have a great day, everyone, and thank you very much.